Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? Now you're selling with Shopify, the global commerce platform supercharging your selling. You have no problem selling online, in person, on social media, and beyond. Gary, easy on the cha-ching.
Oh, sorry, but my Shopify sales are through the roof.
Start selling with Shopify today and discover how millions of businesses around the world use Shopify to ignite their selling. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD experts presentation titled, My Teen with ADHD Lacks All Motivation, How to Build Executive Function Skills and Drive. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Maggie Sibley. Dr. Sibley is a clinical psychologist and researcher at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's Hospital. She studies executive functioning, motivation, and attention problems in adolescents and young adults. Dr. Sibley is the author of Parent-Teen Therapy for Executive Function Deficits and ADHD, Building Skills and Motivation. This is a comprehensive guide for professionals about how to work with families using a therapy she developed called Supporting Teens Autonomy Daily. In today's webinar, we'll discuss the impact of executive function deficits on adolescents and teens with ADHD. A student's constant struggle to perform can lead to a lack of motivation and drive. A common refrain that I'm sure many of you hear is, why bother? Today, our expert will give caregivers and educators, will guide caregivers and educators on how to help these students self-motivate, set goals, and adopt compensatory strategies. Today's webinar will begin a little bit differently. We'd love to engage with our listeners, so we're asking this poll question to our live audience right now. When your teen opts out of schoolwork or activities, which of the following are they most likely to say is the reason? Please select your answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. You'll see the poll results when you submit your response. And while you do that, I'll point out that participants may submit questions anytime during today's live event. To download the slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. If you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive about an hour after the live broadcast. A transcript of today's event will be made available in the coming week. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 430 to access the slides, the webinar replay, the certificate of attendance option, and the webinar transcript. We'll also feature highlights from today's poll results. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Our winter issue is just arriving on people's doorsteps, and it's full of great advice from our experts, like how to survive the holidays with relatives who may not understand your child's ADHD, how to set boundaries, how to navigate your child's treatment plan when they're living with divorced parents in two households. And we polled our readers for clever gift ideas for kids and adults with ADHD. There's also a helpful pull-out guide for how to fix school behavior that you just might want to share with your child's teacher. Subscribe today for your family or to share with those who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Equizon Pro. Equizon Pro is clinically proven nutritional medical food designed to help improve focus, attention, academic performance, and balanced mood for those with ADHD. In fact, clinical studies have shown Equizon Pro can improve ADHD symptoms in as little as 12 weeks. Now is the perfect time to start supporting your child's mind and get them ready for back to school. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Maggie Sibley. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Thanks, everyone. And I am here today to present on our topic that I'm really excited about, which is building motivation in teenagers with ADHD. I'll start out with just some important disclosures. So I'm going to be describing ideas that are included in a book that for professionals that I get royalties from. So I want to make sure that people know about that. I also get paid to train people on some of these approaches, including public trainings. So that's also a potential conflict of interest. And finally, I do some consulting with some of the ADHD medication companies as well in terms of what works well for teens and adults with ADHD. So, as many of you know, ADHD is conceptualized as a lifespan disorder, and we now are able to identify it in some children as early as the preschool age years. It's definitely well characterized in the elementary school age years. That was the first age group where we detected that ADHD was a medical condition. And more recently, we've realized that most children with ADHD do not grow out of their difficulties and that it persists into adolescence for many people. And in fact, it persists into adulthood for many people, such that oftentimes in families, because there's this shared genetic component to ADHD, multiple family members are struggling with ADHD. I would argue that one of the most vulnerable points in life for a person with ADHD is the transition to young adulthood. And I'm showing you data from the multimodal treatment of ADHD study, which was the big study done in the 90s, looking at different treatment strategies for childhood ADHD. And here we can see what happened when we follow those children over time until they were in their 20s. And you can see that the dark line represents kids with ADHD growing up. And the dotted line represents their peers who did not have ADHD. The gap widens between the level of troubles and difficulties that kids with ADHD are having compared to their peers as they transition from high school to young adulthood. And so we see this real difficult, challenging time period for ADHD and transition age youth. So I'm talking about kids kind of moving out of high school and into the college age years, regardless of whether they go to college or not. What do we see in that kind of vulnerable time period? Youth with ADHD are 11 times more likely than their peers to both not have a job or be in school when they're 19 years old. Among college students with ADHD, they have higher risk than college students without ADHD to fail classes and eventually drop out of school. Young adults with ADHD are more likely to change jobs more quickly and get fired. They earn lower wages. They earn lower supervisor ratings. In fact, if we took the lifetime projections for a person with ADHD, they earn 40% less than a person without ADHD. People with ADHD as young adults are more likely to live with their family than be out on their own. They're less likely to have a savings account or a credit card. And in some extreme cases, they even have higher rates of food and housing instability. If we ask them how they feel about their life, they have lower life satisfaction, higher rates of depression, heavier use of substances. And I'm not saying this to scare or depress anyone. I'm saying this because I want to make the point that this is a super important period for us to create successful bridges in the life of kids with ADHD. Are these outcomes set in stone? They are not. So luckily, about half of kids who have ADHD end up in a place where they're managing their symptoms fairly well by the time that they reach adulthood. And about half of kids with ADHD are still struggling and maybe experiencing some of the outcomes that I had on the last slide. The good news about this is that we can have an impact on which trajectory our kids are falling upon. So a big question we have to ask ourselves as the adults in their lives is, what can we do to move more kids onto that positive trajectory headed towards a more successful transition to young adulthood? And it really starts with not when the transition is happening, when they are graduating from high school potentially and moving on to the next step, but a few years earlier. We're going to rewind and talk about what you need to be doing when they're adolescents and middle and high school to prepare for that young adult transition. The biology of ADHD is a good place to start to understand what's happening and what might be leading to some of these problematic factors. So many of you may already know this, but here's the basics. We all have genes that have an influence on who we are and how we act and what our person is in our body. And those genes code into what we call proteins. So these are sort of building blocks in your body that determine all of the things about you biologically. And proteins are those building blocks in our brain in particular. They make neurons, and neurons are the cells in our brain that send signals that basically influence how we act, how we think, what we do. Our neurons also have an impact on our brain's efficiency and abilities and how efficient those neurons are working, how tightly they work together as a network, as a circuit. And so in people with ADHD, in particular, there are certain collection of genes that seem to be working differently than a typical person. Now, ADHD is a polygenic disorder. So what that means is there's not one gene that causes ADHD. It's the additive effect of a lot of genes that are sort of ingredients in ADHD. And if you have enough of those ingredients, you end up looking like a person with ADHD. There are lots of ingredients in ADHD, and you don't have to have them all. But if you have enough of them, that's what you're going to kind of seem like as a person. So one of the main areas of the brain that is affected by the genetics of ADHD is the reward center of the brain. And in particular, the transmission of a chemical called dopamine that I think most of you probably know a little bit about. The neurons in the brain of a person with ADHD act differently than they do in a person without ADHD. And people with ADHD, because of the way some of these proteins are coding, have less sensitive dopamine receptors. They need higher levels of stimulation from their environment, from their life, to produce typical levels of dopamine. So there's several ways that this undermines motivation and executive functions in kids. But one of the kind of simple ways of thinking about this is that on average, during typical situations, less dopamine is moving around in the brain. There's less stimulation than the average person. And so you can see that translating into prominent motivation difficulties in kids with ADHD. It also undermines executive functioning. So there are two deficits here that we can kind of wrap our heads around that are known to be affiliated with ADHD and known to be affiliated with this biological model that I'm describing. The first is executive function deficits. So people with ADHD have less dense communication between their neurons and their prefrontal cortex. And in teenagers in particular, this is an issue because our brains develop from the back to the front. And so in the very front is the prefrontal cortex, which houses all of our executive functions. So for teenagers, the rewards part of their brains that likes things that adults like romantic relationships and socialization and digital media, those pieces of the brain are lighting up really heavily in teenagers because they have that adult-like development that's already happened. But the front of the brain, which puts the brakes on those things and says, hold on a second, it's not a good idea right now to go hang out with my friends because I have a huge test tomorrow. Those executive functions are not online yet. In fact, they're not fully developed, research suggests, until people are about 25. So because of that, all adolescents are kind of struggling with their executive functioning compared to adults. Add ADHD on top of that, and you see kids who at this point in their life have just a horrible time with things like working memory, set shifting, goal pursuit, inhibiting their behaviors, organization and planning, self-monitoring. So this is a really vulnerable time period in the life of a person with ADHD. And at the same time, their schools and their extracurriculars and their life in general are calling upon them to be able to do a more complex activities and manage lots of things that take executive functioning to be successful. The other side is what we call the hot reward circuitry. And so this is your basic response to rewards. And for people with ADHD, usually the dopamine will start firing when you're anticipating something good coming and make you want to pursue that good thing, right? For people with ADHD, because that signal isn't as strong, they're not activated as much as an average person might be. And so that translates into prominent motivation problems. And for those of you guys who have tried to use reward systems with your kids, they don't feel like they work as well as for other people. It's biological. This is why. But there is some kind of good news to share. So this is a really cool study. It's an MRI study. So they basically did brain scans of kids from age 8 to age 22 every 2 years. And you can see 3 lines here. The green line, or sorry, let me start with the red line. The red line is kids with ADHD who continue to have ADHD all the way through adulthood. And this group of people, you can see, stays lower than the blue line, which is typically developing neurotypical people that are their peers. What we're looking at is cortical density. So the denser your brain is, the better of a thing that is, because your brain is more efficient. And we're specifically looking at the prefrontal cortex area. The green line is what's interesting, because the green line is kids who were diagnosed with ADHD as children, and as adults, they no longer had ADHD. They were managing it very well. This line jumps trajectories in the brain. So their brain actually develops differently than the brain of a person with ADHD, specifically in that critical period of adolescence. Look at where that jump is happening. It's in the teenage years. And so this is a really important time period to be thinking about what ingredients do we need to put in place to help kids, especially develop their brain in the area of executive functioning. So these key areas, working memory, self-monitoring, behavioral inhibition, this is specifically the areas that kids with ADHD struggle with. But also, if we can learn to overcome these difficulties, this is potentially a key to helping kids manage their symptoms better long-term. And we know it's possible. So for us, we have to ask ourselves, so what can we do to move teens onto this path towards managing their ADHD better, to being one of those sort of success stories in the 50% in adulthood? What should we be doing day to day with kids? So I'm going to share with you guys a few ideas. Number one, I'm going to talk to you guys about this idea that you cannot necessarily yet directly brain train your way into better executive functions. So despite what you may hear from certain companies, there are not really any effective cognitive training interventions that have an impact on ADHD symptoms that are out there right now. Instead, we have to do an alternative, and that is to compensate for those difficulties and hope that by forming good habits, kids can sort of do the hard work of getting themselves to learn how to manage their ADHD. The best example I have of this is that if you have ADHD, I cannot train your brain to be less forgetful, but I can teach you to write things down and to recognize when it's important for you to write things down because you know you're forgetful. And that's the concept that is important to think about here. So we can teach kids executive functioning skills in the area of organization, time management, and planning skills. And those skills, if applied, would potentially be a great way to start getting kids to develop that part of their brain during the time of their life where that part of the brain is developing, right? So what are those skills consist of? First of all, in this digital world, the way these skills are applied is changing every day. So I'm going to hit things conceptually more so than I am going to tell you the specific app or the specific, worksheet that would be helpful for this, because this is just changing all the time. But it's things like getting people with ADHD to say, you know what, I need to write things down because I have trouble with my memory. And that could look like different, there could be different applications of that. Learning to keep organization systems to manage your materials, but also how to follow through on them and keep up with them. Using step-by-step mental processes to strategically plan out things like homework time. Getting good with those planning skills. Learning memory strategies to help with information retention on tests. Learning how to make decisions slowly, step by step, thinking through what you're doing. Making a homework plan that puts structure in place. And people have been doing this stuff with kids in schools for years, especially in special education, right? So if you have an IEP for your child, there might be a pull-out service in your school where someone's helping them in like a resource room with getting their book bags organized, keeping track of what their assignments are, making sure they plan out how they're going to do those assignments, get their time managed well. Maybe set up a structured routine with them. There's things that you might have been working with a psychologist at home that you can get help with for coming up with routines. So this is all known. These are skills that we can do to help kids. There's a lot of workbooks out there that go over skills like this. If you're a clinician, besides the book that I have, there's one by people at Mass General, Susan Spritch. They came up with one. There's the HOPS program by Josh Langberg. These are all workbooks. If you're a parent, there's the Smart But Scattered series. There's a lot of stuff out there you can Google, and there's a lot of apps out there, and they're all fighting the good fight, right? They all have good ideas for how we can organize and do this stuff. But let me tell you guys something. All of this addresses like what to do. But I know a lot of you guys are probably shaking your head right now because you can't get your kids to do this stuff. And so the real problem here is not coming up with these secret, beautiful strategies that solve everything. They're out there on the market. You guys can find them. It's how do you get kids to use them, right? How do you get a teenager to actually apply this stuff? And that's what I'm here to talk about today. I run a clinic where we have parents and kids come in and work with therapists who are psychologists or psychologist trainees to try to help uptake of these skills in families. And we did a study last year where we had 1,000 audio recordings of these therapy sessions, and we cataloged carefully all of the barriers to using these skills that were being mentioned on these 1,000 tapes to try to understand what is the real experience of families. And here's what we learned. In 3/4 of families, the teen didn't like using those skills. In 70% of families, the parents were tired, exhausted, had a lot going on, and weren't doing their side of the bargain of holding the kids accountable. 60% of the families, the teen was really forgetful, and even if he had good intentions, forgot to follow through. In 56% of the families, the teen had this belief that they don't need to change, that they're fine the way they are, that this is a waste of their time. In 50% of families, the teen believed that there was no point because they're not a good student anyways. And in 50% of the families, the parent was helping so much that the teen didn't even have an opportunity to do things on their own. So I hope this feels more familiar to people here, because this is what we've been seeing in the families that we've been working with. There's a lot of barriers to using these skills. Even though they're out there, you can find them, they're smart. So let's talk about how we address these barriers. We've got multiple roadblocks here, both on the parent side or the adult side. If like this could also be true in a school setting with teachers and educators, and on the youth side. A lot of them have to do with how people feel about things. A lot of motivational barriers. So youth roadblocks, I'm fine. I don't need help. I'm tired of trying. I'm embarrassed. I don't care about anything. I'm incapable. And then also the big one, lack of follow through. I do want to do this. It seems like a good idea, but I just forget. the adult side, giving up because the strategies don't produce immediate results. I'm going to make one of my key messages today be that this is a slow and steady road. It's not a transformative process. If anyone promises you that they can change your kid in a few weeks, I would be skeptical. Feeling like accountability is just too much effort to like kind of hold kids to things, or feeling like it requires you to be 100% on top of them. And that's exhausting. Just not being interested in getting involved anymore. Some people are just done. They're sick of it. They just like feel like their kid doesn't appreciate what they've done. And they've decided that it's better to accept what they can't change and move on and protect their sanity. Counterproductive parenting, like too much helping and prompting, which doesn't give kids an opportunity to become independent. Belief that your kid is lazy. So, I mean, all of this is a normal response to the experience of having like a youth with ADHD in the household. So I don't criticize anyone for experiencing any of these barriers. And yet they can hold people back from, picking an approach that feels right to them. And this is something that I show parents that I work with in the clinic. This is from our research. We actually gave a survey to 300 parents of youth with ADHD who are either in middle and high school, and asked them like, what's your academic support strategy? What are you doing? How did you get there? And our findings were, there was one group of parents who on the left side, what I'd call this is the unconnected parent. They really over time become disengaged from the teen's academics. They don't even know what grades they're getting. They don't want to look at the grade book online. They want the teens to just figure it out. They believe it's pointless to work with the teen because the teen's not invested. Maybe they're even just too exhausted or too busy to just like even engage with the teen at all. And they may be completely unaware of the teen's grades. So this is one extreme, right? That the parent is just tired and they give up. They avoid checking and seeing what's going on. And the problem here is that the teen ends up lacking accountability. So, our teens with ADHD are struggling, and we got to have some guardrails up in order to kind of, put limits, hold them accountable. It's their choice if they follow those rules or not. But we want to send the message of, this is what my expectations are, and this is what happens. If you follow them, it's a good thing. And if you don't follow them, there are restrictions. On the other side, you've got another natural reaction to having a teen with ADHD, which is what we call like the personal assistant strategy, which becomes getting reinforced to become overly involved in the kid's work because you're really feeling like if I don't, they're going to fail and it's going to be a disaster. Some parents tell us that they sit with the teen like through the whole homework time for hours, just like kind of keeping them moving. Some parents tell us that they're, have the teacher on speed dial, right? They're texting them all the time, just trying to stay on top of things for the kid, that they're checking the grades online every day and refreshing, looking for that missing assignment so they can go figure out what happened. Some of these parents told us that they would react to the teen not doing things by taking things away in a way that was not necessarily pre-planned. Some parents told us they did homework for the teen just to get it done so everyone could go to bed. So this is a natural reaction. And one of the consequences of this is that the teen becomes really dependent on the parent for those reminders, for someone to kind of check things for them. They don't need to do it because they know their parent's on top of it. So these are two natural reactions, and it's a pendulum, right? A lot of families tell us that they've been both. One at one point, then they end up the other, then they're back over. And so one of the things we're working with people is trying to find the middle ground in between these two. Find that balance of autonomy support, demanding autonomy, but also not completely demanding it to the point where you're not there to, provide some scaffolding as a parent or an educator or anyone working with the youth. So what in the world can we do to motivate teens with ADHD? Let's look at the history here. So the first trick in the book was to use rewards, right? So you all know this already. In this scenario, the adult's creating relationships between things the kids like, their leisure time, and responsibilities that they're required to do. In this scenario, you're using your natural consequences are not sufficiently motivating. And so you're manufacturing a consequence to try to promote and incentivization of behavior. This is logical for a person with ADHD, given those dopamine deficits. It's not wrong per se, because if you think about it, if you can get them psyched about some sort of reward, they may be willing to do something they don't want to do in order to achieve that reward. But this is not a solution that can address the full picture. This addresses short-term motivation. It's a good strategy for you to have in your toolbox for getting through something very specific, but it doesn't address long-term motivation and it doesn't address self-motivation. So what I'm going to be advocating for is this as a tool in your toolbox, but that it's just one tool and that you should become smart about when to use it and when to use something else. The motivation deficits associated with ADHD are many. Let's look at them. Here are our puzzle pieces. Lower interest level in school, in extracurriculars, in just general life. This is all because of their brain chemistry. Less motivated by natural rewards. Here's one that's more related to a psychological process. Beliefs that you are inferior to others. That comes from the higher level of negative feedback that people with ADHD get across their life. You start to believe that, actually I just am incapable. It's just something's wrong with me. That will make you unmotivated to try hard. Reliance on others. We just saw the parental practice that can contribute to this. It happens at school with educators and teachers too. There is some support and scaffolding that needs to happen, but it has to be well thought out so that it doesn't become a dependency. Less interest in long-term goals. The immediate gratification aspect of ADHD means that there isn't as much excitement produced in a person with ADHD when thinking about an outcome that's 5 years down the road, right? That's how their brain works. Consistency is hard for people with ADHD. Sometimes they can do things for a little while, but it's really hard to keep it going once the initial interest and novelty wears off. Remember, if you have ADHD, novelty wanes for you over time and is also one of the most powerful motivators for a person with ADHD. I'll explain that in a second. Change may feel impossible. Too many barriers, too many roadblocks, right? Forgetfulness is a barrier to motivation. You forget why you care about something, right? Lacking a sense of urgency. The dopamine response is not as strong. It's not going to feel as urgent for you to approach certain goals or to get things done on time. So all of these are byproducts of the biology of ADHD. And so we need a multi-pronged approach to building motivation in teenagers. It can't just be use rewards. And so what I'm going to argue to you all is that in order to put all these puzzle pieces together, it's the small things that you guys need to do every day over time that's going to make the difference. It's not going to be a magic wand approach. And so it's really getting comfortable and patient with the sense that you're going to do things today that will not pay off for 10 years, but you should do them anyways. I'm going to be closing this presentation with 9 concrete actions that I think can be the little things you do every day in order to improve adolescent motivation. And we're going to go through each of these, and I'm going to try to explain why I put them on the list. And then I'm looking forward to all of your discussion and questions at the end. So here's the first one. Help them discover things they're interested in. There's one part of the motivation system of kids with ADHD that is relatively intact, and that is pleasure-based motivation. For some reason, if it's the thing that you really care about, kids with ADHD are fairly good at being consistent at it. We have to leverage this system. For a person with ADHD, we need to help them find productive, healthy interests that could be potential career and education paths. Because for them to be successful and find a sustainable, stable career, it needs to be something that they are personally, intrinsically interested in. Because unlike, their neurotypical peers, they're not going to have as easy of a time getting themselves through something really aversive like medical school, for example, to get that long-term goal of being a doctor, even if they really want to be a doctor. It's going to be harder for them. And so we really have to find where they are really highly interested in and help them not only discover those interests, but develop competencies in those interests so that they can be successful in those areas. But be thoughtful about these long shot areas where there's a very few people who get to have a career in that area, because I think that is a temptation also for kids with ADHD to say, I want to be a YouTube video game reviewer and make a lot of money. That's cool, but very few people get to succeed in that way. So we want to help them take the time early on in adolescence to promote a range of interests. So that includes both those things that the kids really like that are long shots, as well as some safer options that they also really like. Here's number 2, watch for environmental fit. Demoralization is a huge issue for teenagers with ADHD, and it has long-term consequences on their self-esteem, on their mental health, and on their ability to take chances in life and try things out. People won't take chances if they think they'll always fail. The environment that they are in every day of their life, whether it's related to school, related to their family, their extracurriculars, their friends, those are where the messages about yourself come from. And so we really need to be thoughtful about what environments we're putting kids with ADHD in, because even if they are white knuckling through adolescence, trying their best, this is going to be a time in their life where a lot of them will struggle. And we don't want them to hear messages that, you're a worse person than other people. So we want to find the best possible environment for them, a place that seems to value their strengths. Avoid environments that lead to demoralization. And you may have to do more work than you would for a typical kid, gathering information about a wide range of educational or career options that are available to them. And you may have to do this with your kid because they may not self-start and do it on their own yet, in order to help figure out what environments are possible and to weigh the pros and cons in each. And think about your family too. What is it that you need to do in your family and in your house to make sure that's a good fitting environment, that they're hearing positive messages? Number 3, set goals with them using baby steps. So I want you to think about what the teen can do right now. And I want you to think about trying to get them to do 10% more, not striving for what you think they should be able to do at this age, because it's through these tiny little steps forward over time that we will see the most success. If we ask for a lot and the teen has no motivation to do it and feels demoralized, you'll get a lot. It's like the tortoise and the hare, right? Like you're not going to get as far in the long run with that approach because you're going to get resistance. You're going to get resistance and people are going to feel like they're failing. So just ask for a little bit more than you get now. And also sit down and have conversations with the kids about what they care about and try to help them make some goals for themselves that are personally meaningful, that feel achievable. Focus on better performance, not good performance. Next, creating accountability and limits. So you need to have some consequences in place. You need to have guardrails in place. None of us want it to be punitive where you feel like you take everything away. But kids with ADHD don't have the brain development yet of being able to put the brakes on themselves. And we don't want them to make some big mistakes that can help or that can cause them to have big problems when they get older. So we really need to be thinking about moderate, consistent consequences because those are more effective than big, unpredictable punishments. Having expectations defined up front so kids know what happens when they break rules, and making sure that if you do use punishment that it fits the crime and that it has some teachable moment in it, right? So if you're really disrespectful to grandma, write her apology letter. If you make a mess in the house, reorganize the garage, those kinds of things. Try to keep your routine at home and at school as consistent as possible. Teens with ADHD will tell you they like unstructured environments, but they actually perform pretty poorly in them. Consistent home routine can strategically build in incentives in ways that you can leverage those rewards principles. Natural incentives, things like we have a rule, electronics time starts after people have done their homework. Or, you can have downtime when you get home from school, but it's going to be a Netflix episode that has a clear end point. So we don't have to have an argument about when it's time to get off your video games, for example. We have dessert in our house, but it always happens after the dishes are done, right? So it's just these little things that sort of help motivate and send the right message. And it prevents you from needing to remind them to do things, right? If this is just the routine in our house. Manufacturing opportunities for autonomy. You are going to need to restrict the freedoms of your teen with ADHD probably more than you want to. And that's going to lead to reduced opportunities for them to build independence when they don't get to participate in something because, they did something that was problematic. They're also not going to necessarily put themselves in the position to earn autonomy because they may not be the kids who are, getting leadership positions in school and stuff like that. You need to manufacture opportunities for them so that they're still developing autonomy when they're not naturally finding themselves in these opportunities. These opportunities will promote decision-making, planning, self-sufficiency. So you can think about what this would look like for you, but it could be something like having them have a night where they cook dinner, or sending them off with a shopping list for you, or having them plan, a weekend trip that the family's going to take. Create opportunities where they get to do something that they can feel proud of. If they don't do it well, who cares? They'll learn, but it's showing that you want to give them that opportunity. And then this one's always a big one for me, building self-confidence. So adolescents with ADHD have lower self-esteem than peers. They get a lot of negative feedback from other people and from situations. How we build confidence is for them to see themselves succeeding. And so we need to find places where they can be successful and help them develop skills in those areas so that they continue to be successful in those areas. Help them find friends that are accepting and share their interests. You may have to go out of the way to figure this out, especially in-person friends, right? Like online friends are okay, but you probably want to also have some in-person social interaction. So you as the parent may need to do some of the work and discovering some options because your teen just may not be motivated yet to do that research themselves. We want to be asking ourselves, is this child receiving more positive messages about themselves than negative messages? And if the answer is no, you may want to think about what you can do about that. This is one of my top tips. Hold a weekly meeting with your teen where you just talk about what's going on. And this avoids a bad situation triggering the only time we ever talk about how things are going in school is when I find out you failed a test, right? Talk in advance. Here's some example meeting topics. Recognizing positive things they did last week, looking at the grades together, discussing how things are going at school, reviewing things that you want them to do in the next week, problem solving things that they feel stressed about, coming up with a weekly schedule, researching a new activity together, choosing high school courses, looking at asking them if there's anything that they want from you. And if they say they want a new freedom, laying out what that path to earn that would look like. Asking the teen for feedback on how you're parenting them and if there's anything they want from you to keep that conversation going two ways. And finally, I want to talk to you guys about the way we talk to teens. This could be a whole presentation on its own, but we want kids to find self-motivation instead of us telling them what they should do. We have a tendency as adults who feel frustrated with a teen to try to convince them of things, to argue with them about why they're wrong, to try to use logic to persuade them or make a point, to sometimes be coercive, and to sometimes get frustrated and shame them, which is not good if the self-esteem is already low. So instead of that, we need to learn not to impart on them, but to elicit from them. And I'm going to share some strategies below that come from a tool called motivational interviewing that's been used in the counseling and the substance use field for a long time, and that I use heavily in the parenting work that I do. So some ideas from this are giving positive attention to the teen's own ideas about change, finding out what they care about. Don't give as much attention to their counterproductive ideas. When you argue with them, you give it attention. Instead, you want to just not give it attention and give your attention instead to the good things that they're suggesting and saying that they want to do. Use as much language to emphasize autonomy as you can. Things like, you're making a choice to do X, Y, and Z. This is your decision. So you're really letting them know and helping them think about themselves as an autonomous person who has their own, makes their own decisions about themselves. Providing affirmations, which is noticing all the good things they do right and giving them specific feedback on that. Listening to them in a way that shows that you hear them. Talking to them using open-ended questions, right? So that gives longer answers from people. trying not to act like an authoritarian all the time and just sort of like coming alongside of them and trying to treat them like an adult and being relatable. Ask them to design their own plans. If they get it wrong, let them try it out, let them stumble, but then be there to process with them if it worked or not, so that they do get an opportunity to kind of learn from experience. So my final thoughts are what I said earlier. You're going to do a lot of things now and they're not going to show results, but do them anyways. It is these small things that if you guys are doing this over time, you're doing the type of interactions with youth that are shown to pay off. But we don't always have the ability to see the micro steps, month to month that are happening. It's only when you zoom out that you really see the big picture. So a few places to go from here if you're interested in learning more. Motivational interviewing, I think, is like, for me at least, a toolkit that I think is great for both professionals of all kinds working with kids with ADHD. So you could read this book on motivational interviewing if you're a reader, and I think it's actually really good and describes it well. It talks about a lot of the concepts that I went through in this presentation. If you're a professional, if you're a coach, if you're a healthcare professional, if you're an educator, and you want to get training in this approach, there's the Mint website. Those are the official MI trainers, and you can get on the calendar, see if there's a training online or in your area to do. I'm a Mint trainer. I don't do a lot of this. It's my side thing. It's not my main job, but I do one public MI training a year. There's a QR code if you want to learn more about it. I focus mostly on how it applies to ADHD. If you're a parent, here's a QR code for a article that elaborates on everything that I presented on today. And it's got a lot of more ideas. It's a free article, so you could go there if you want to read more about some of the ideas that were talked about. And now I think it's time for our Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. Of course, if you don't get a chance to ask a question to me today and you want to reach out over email, go ahead and I'll do my best to get back to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Sibley, for those practical, actionable tips. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Equizon Pro once more for sponsoring this webinar. I also want to tell you about the results from the poll question we asked at the top of the webinar, which was, when your teen opts out of schoolwork or activities, what is the most likely reason they give? And here's what you said. About 20% said, I forgot. The next most common responses were, I'm too tired, it's too hard, I didn't understand what the teacher wanted, the teacher never told us about it, I ran out of time, I'm too busy. So there you have it. So now we'll get to the questions. So what do you do, one person writes, when your child doesn't think he has a problem? How do you handle that?
That's a really nice question that I think a lot of people can relate to. Difficulty self-evaluating is something that's been seen in ADHD as sort of a common feature. And so I think the main thing is that you don't want to argue with them and you don't want to bombard them with all the reasons why they're wrong. I think the best approach here is an experimental approach where you let them try out whatever it is they think that they want to do, but come up with a way that you guys can evaluate whether it's working or not, and then have a conversation afterwards with some objective evidence about whether it worked or not and get them to give you their take. And that is a better conversation starter than probably telling them that they're wrong. That being said, I think you guys as parents should figure out where you draw the line on your deal breakers. If there are situations that involve safety, if there are situations that involve a potential very bad consequence happening for your teen, those are the times you should feel the right to step in and to be more coercive and to sort of say, I'm sorry, but I have to be authoritarian here. This is what's going to happen. So, but you don't want to do that too much. You really need to pick your battles and know when you have the patience to sort of help them learn from their experiences and gain more insight versus the times when you're just going to sort of say, no, I'm sorry, you're wrong, and we're doing it my way.
So this question, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to as well. I can't seem to get my son to respond to any of my suggestions. He fights everything. He's in a new school. It's causing worse behavior. He's failing. What can I do?
So I think one of the ideas here is that we want to give our suggestions in a way that makes it seem like no can't be an answer. So multiple choice, right? Being able to say, it's your choice. There's 5 or 6 things we can do here. You tell me which one makes the most sense to you. So that's a way of like giving autonomy in a situation, as long as all 6 of those options are reasonable to you. The other thing is you can always say to your kids, like, here's an issue that it seems like is happening, and try to elicit from them, like, what they would want to do to solve it. And again, try to use and build on their own ideas instead of trying to argue with them. The worst thing you can do is argue with them. You'll never convince them, I promise you. This is where motivational interviewing, for me at least, has been a huge toolkit, an eye-opener about how to deal with oppositional people. And even though I didn't have a lot of time to go into it, I encourage people to kind of check out that approach, because I think you'll see a lot of good ideas in it.
So I have 2 questions, and they're both like the flip side of a coin. One is, she says, I'm a teacher. What should I do when a student refuses to do an assignment? And then the other question is from a mom who says, what are appropriate consequences for a child who refuses to do homework? What are some good examples?
Everyone's different. I have to say that first, right? So, if I give you an idea, I can't know if it'll work. When I get to work with families and we get to know each other really well, I can help them figure out a tailored solution. But I think the key concepts here are, is this one of your important behaviors that you want to focus on with the kid? If the answer is yes, then let's come up with a consequence. And it's not what the consequence is, but how you implement it that's important. On the other hand, if the answer is no, I have bigger issues that I want to focus on, then you would let it go, because you don't want to be trying to fix all 100 things the kid is struggling with. You want to have one or two that you're really focused on, so they don't hear all this negative feedback. So say homework is like the key thing. The important thing is that you explain to them the reason why you're asking them to do homework if they don't want to do it. And so they understand that you're not just being arbitrary, and that you let them know. I think that you assess the barriers to why it's not happening and see if you can solve a barrier before you get into some sort of punishment situation. If you feel like it's just an issue that really has to do with incentivizing and you feel like putting a consequence in place could be effective, then I think you should brainstorm and sit down with the teen and ask them, what do they feel like is an effective and fair consequence for not doing homework, and involve them in that conversation. Some of your kids are going to be reasonable in this conversation and some of them won't. So that being said, in the end, the most important thing is that this is something that restarts every day in order to give the opportunity for a fresh start and tomorrow's homework to potentially be done. It may not seem like the consequence is working to motivate them, but it can be okay if that's happening. Because if you're saying to your teen, like, look, my expectation is that you do your homework. You have a choice to make about whether you do it or not. If you choose not to do it, that's your choice. But in my household, like, people don't get to go on their video games if they decide not to do their homework. And then that resets every day. It's not like you're taking something away forever and demoralizing them. You're giving them a fresh start and you're not holding a grudge. It has to be individualized, potentially with like a therapist if you're having trouble, what that reward or consequence is to what your teen in particular cares about. And the expectations for the homework has to be fair too. If they're not doing any homework right now, I would usually set a goal with a family to see if you can just do 15 minutes. And then I'd reward that. And when they've gotten good at 15 minutes, then we might go to 30 minutes. And I've had a lot of success working with families where we've done that type of baby steps approach. So I threw a bunch of like off the top of my head ideas, but that's not an easy problem to solve, or else you probably would have solved it, right? So when these problems are more complex, don't be afraid to get some professional help, like work with a counselor or a therapist who can just help you create the space for talking through these things. Problem solving, brainstorming. They're not going to have all the answers either, by the way, but hopefully they can promote a good process of you guys problem solving together.
How do you address educators at school in a productive and positive manner to help motivate teens with ADHD at school?
Let me make sure I understand that question. Like, what can educators do to help?
Well, no, I think that parents want to know, how can they talk to educators at school about strategies to motivate their teen at school?
Yeah. Schools are overwhelmed right now. And a lot of people in schools want to do more than they possibly can with the resources available to them. And I think we need to remember that. Unfortunately, people can only do what their job allows them to do. So that's frustrating, but this is a key factor in choosing the environment for your child. You know, it's a privilege to have choices, I guess. Some school districts have choice schools. Some you have to go to the school that you're assigned to unless, you have some sort of special exception. But the best thing that we can do is create open communication and be polite. And if the school is not equipped to help your child, you as a parent can potentially be the one to provide the motivation, which requires you to have good communication about what's happening at school. That's getting better, I'm finding, with all the information being put online about what's due for assignments and if they've been turned in. But you should also make sure you have the appropriate accommodations in place for your child. So if your child should have an IEP, that's going to get you a lot more resources from that school than if your child doesn't have an IEP or a 504 plan. So you have the ability to kind of hold schools accountable a little bit more if your kids do have an IEP. So I would encourage people, and you can go on the CHAD website to find out how to get an IEP, request one from your school as well as a 504 plan if that's a new idea for you and you want to learn more about that.
AttitudeMag.com also has great strategies for IEP and from experts. So I would suggest people check that out as well. How can you boost self-esteem when the child sees themselves as a failure and loses motivation to even try? I know you talked about self-esteem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You can't argue with them and correct them. All you can do is give them new evidence that that's not true. So you've got to figure out what positive experiences can I put this child in where they'll start seeing evidence that, oh, I'm actually okay at things. Oh, people actually like me. It's tough, but that's the objective. You can't convince them of that. They won't just magically change their mind until they have evidence that refutes that belief.
Do you have suggestions for maintaining a consistent home routine when there are two separate households and the parents have different outlooks on consequences and rewards?
I think that working with a therapist is probably the best suggestion because you're going to need a neutral person to try to help navigate that. I think that would be pretty tough. When I work with kids with ADHD and their parents, I often request that we just work with one parent because when there's a divorced household, even because marital issues coming into the therapy room with the kid often take the attention off the kid. So I would get a professional involved.
So one person writes, is it a good idea to let a child suffer their own consequences and fail?
It's a balance. So I think a little bit of that in a place where the consequences are going to have a low impact on their big picture of their life is probably good. So kids can kind of see the cause and effect relationships. But I think you have to put guardrails on that because if you, obviously some consequences could really mess up their life. And obviously you're protecting their self-esteem at the same time. So it's really hard, but you're trying to walk that balance where they get a little bit of that, but also have a little protection. And slowly over time, if you can try to walk that balance, I think you'll see the results, but you don't always see it in the exact situation you're talking about.
A few people have asked how does stress impact motivation?
Stress, absolutely. Yeah, mm-hmm. It absolutely undermines motivation. If I had more time, we could talk about all the things that can undermine motivation that aren't related to ADHD, whether it's depression, anxiety, stress, other mental health problems. problems with your family. There are a lot of other things. And I think the best thing to do is to inventory and always try to be a problem solver, a detective. Like, what is the reason for my child's motivation issues? And that can sometimes lead you to the right solution. But it's that environmental fit again, right? So you want to be thinking about, like, is this the best environment for my child? If my goal for them is to develop a sense of self-esteem, a sense of competency, and to feel like they can be successful. And that's a piece of the picture for sure.
So unfortunately, that had to be our last question. We're out of time, but we thank you for joining us today and for contributing your expertise to our ADHD community. And make sure you don't miss future Attitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 430 to access the slides, the webinar replay, the certificate of attendance option, and the webinar transcript. We'll also feature highlights from today's poll results. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Our winter issue is just arriving on people's doorsteps, and it's full of great advice from our experts, like how to survive the holidays with relatives who may not understand your child's ADHD, how to set boundaries, how to navigate your child's treatment plan when they're living with divorced parents in 2 households. And we polled our readers for clever gift ideas for kids and adults with ADHD. There's also a helpful pull-out guide for how to fix school behavior that you just might want to share with your child's teacher. Subscribe today for your family or to share with those who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Thank you.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.